My name's John Grosh, and I'm the editor-in-chief at the Journal of International Affairs. On behalf of the editorial board and the distinguished advisory board, welcome to the Journal's Thought Leadership Forum. Tonight's forum is in celebration of our newest edition of the Journal, which focuses solely on transnational organized crime. Now, for many, organized crime conjures quaint images of Godfather movies, but our focus tonight is in our latest issue, is organized crime's most modern manifestations. In particular, its transnational nature and its destructive reality worldwide. Organized crime today weaves seamlessly across sovereign borders, which, as you can imagine, produces a host of challenges to combating illicit activity. We hope this issue will draw attention to transnational organized crime as a staggering global problem. And we're confident that through our careful assembly of scholarship and diverse expertise, this issue will help better understand this 21st century phenomenon. It's proven to be a rich topic, and I'm very excited to hear our insight from tonight's panel of experts. Now, the Journal of International Affairs has been continuously in print since 1947, making it one of the nation's oldest foreign affairs periodicals. Last year, the Journal launched the ebook edition, which will continue to be available for each issue on Amazon.com. The Journal is also very active on the web. In fact, in the last 30 days, the Journal website received traffic from 143 countries and territories. This is largely due to the fact that, along with each print issue, the Journal publishes weekly on the website. These publications include scholarly articles and commentary on a variety of international affairs topics. So as consumers of the Journal, I would encourage you all to have a look at our website if you haven't already. I'd also like to take this moment to introduce our spring issue. The topic will be on Latin America, and it will discuss ways the region has transitioned during the last 2 decades and the future implications for the region and the globe. Now, before we begin our discussion, I would like to acknowledge a few people whose assistance was essential to this publication. Thank you to the diverse group of scholars who contributed to this issue. Thank you to Dean Lieberman and the staff and the administration at CIPA and to our esteemed advisory board. And thank you to the editorial, production, and digital assistants who comprise over 70 CIPA students and whose hard work on this issue has personally been one of the most inspiring aspects of this publication. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion tonight. Leading the discussion will be Dipali Mukhopadhyay, an expert on conflict and state formation and a recent addition to the CIPA faculty. Professor Mukhopadhyay received her doctorate from the Fletcher School in 2010 and was a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University in 2011. She is currently finishing a forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press entitled Warlords, Strongmen Governors, and State Building in Afghanistan. This spring she'll teach a course on warlords, militiamen, and mafias, and another course on foreign intervention and conflict management. So Professor Mukhopadhyay, thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks to John and Ty and the whole editorial board of the Journal for inviting me to facilitate tonight's discussion. And for designing this thought leadership forum on an issue that profoundly affects communities around the world, including our own. Tonight, I am charged not only with encouraging leadership in thought, but also with provoking leadership in action to address this very pressing issue of transnational organized crime. This is not a new phenomenon. In fact, I'm teaching a course in the spring which looks back at the notion of organized crime for several centuries. And we do know that we have seen a tremendous proliferation of criminal networks, both small and large, at increasing rates throughout the world year after year. Whether referred to as transnational organized crime, illicit networks, or globalized crime, in one form or another, we are speaking about a whole collection of growing threats posed to international security, financial markets, development and human rights through money laundering, trafficking of human beings, weapons and drugs, cybercrime, and exploitation of the environment. For the purposes of our discussion tonight, we will define transnational organized crime as the coordinated efforts and operations across national borders for the purpose of attaining power, influence, or financial gain, wholly or in part by illegal means. As a supplement to the academic writings and interviews from thought leaders that are featured in the current edition of the Journal of International Affairs, tonight we are joined by a panel of experts and practitioners who spend tireless hours working on transnational organized crime and human trafficking issues. We look forward to these panelists shedding light on current patterns and proposing solutions to address the number of serious problems that we face on this front. Their combined expertise will paint a clearer picture for us of organized crime and how the international community, whether students and researchers, activists, government leaders, diplomats, nonprofit NGOs, as well as private sector entities, can work together to tackle this enormous challenge. So we are thrilled to have diverse perspectives and experience represented on our panel tonight. And first we will hear from our keynote speaker, Allison Friedman, who works under the leadership of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who has often spoken of the need to build what she calls a global architecture of cooperation to solve the problems that no single country can solve alone. Ms. Allison Friedman serves as the Deputy Director of the United States State Department Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking of Persons. She was appointed to this position in September 2011 after working for 2 years as the office's Senior Coordinator for Public Engagement. Ms. Friedman oversees the office's Foreign Assistance Grant Program, which supports anti-trafficking efforts in 37 countries around the world, and the office's public engagement efforts, which include public and media outreach, partnerships with civil society, and coordinating the U.S. government's interagency anti-trafficking work. She also serves as senior advisor to the Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, Louise Shelley. Prior to her service at the Department of State, Ms. Friedman was Executive Director of the Alliance to Stop Slavery and End Trafficking, a California-based NGO. She also served as District Director for former Congressman Jane Harman and as California Policy Director for People for the American Way. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Allison Friedman.
I wanted to start by thanking Columbia University and SEPA for inviting me to speak today, and also Dipali and Ty for all the work that they did in pulling this together. I found in recent years in working on trafficking in persons that the more we understand about it, the more sense it makes to discuss the fight against trafficking in the broader context of a wide range of issues. Women's issue, human rights issue, a migration issue, a health issue, a labor issue, an economic issue, a security issue, and a transnational organized crime issue. But the term is misleading. To put it simply, trafficking in persons is a manifestation of modern slavery. The legal definition includes 3 components, basically the process, how somebody becomes enslaved, the means, force, fraud, or coercion, and the end, the exploitation of that person. But it fundamentally boils down to holding somebody in compelled service for someone else's profit. I think one of the greatest disservices that the modern movement gave to this ancient crime was a title that suggests that it's somehow about moving people rather than abuse. Of course, there's often that element, which is why it's included in a convening like this one, where much of the content addresses the criminal movement of inanimate objects, highly dangerous objects to be sure, but still objects. The difference, of course, is at the end of the day, you can't victimize a drug or kill a machine gun's family, which is why this isn't about the movement of an object, it's about the exploitation of people. And unlike gun violence and drug trade and terrorism and illicit arms, all of which threaten the powerful and powerless alike, trafficking in persons kind of uniquely targets the world's most vulnerable. That's the reason why, among all the other issues I listed, trafficking in persons is first and foremost a crime, and with all other crimes, government has a specific responsibility to address it to make sure that the rule of law really does extend to the people that are most often denied that rule of law. And when those in power fail to meet our most basic obligation, trafficking stories emerge. Like the kid who's been forced to dive for fish since the age of 5, beaten with oars overhead if he surfaces too quickly, and if he's lucky enough to make it to a shelter. And I've seen really awful video footage of this, and they try to teach the kids how to sing "If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands." He doesn't know how to smile. Or a woman in Texas forced into prostitution by a group of traffickers who targeted single mothers through their children's daycare. Or the boy I met in East Asia who became a child soldier because he couldn't afford to pay the policeman the $14 bribe, and so he sold him. Or the woman who, despite frequent beatings, held on to her humanity such that when her traffickers asked her to beat their own children for crying, she refused and was rewarded by having boiling water poured over her head, such that when armed forces raided the Gaddafi's son's compound many weeks later, her wounds were still seeping. Or the 4-year-old boy, whose image is seared in my mind, who was sold to a family to work as a domestic servant. And when the family found him not very helpful at age 4, they set him on fire and left him by the side of the road, dead. He wound up surviving. And then there are girls in New York City who keep getting mistaken for criminals because they don't look the way people expect trafficking victims to look, or don't act the way they expect trafficking victims to act because they're likely hardened by the torture they're subjected to, or we failed to find her in time to get her the help she needed, and she's now over 18, and everyone assumes she chose her life, even though her pimp long ago took away those choices. I could go on. There are millions of stories like these, and I think that's part of the point I'd like to make here today. While we can never forget or cease to be driven by those stories, they remind us of the humanity and the brutality behind this crime. Stories alone can't and should not drive policy. So here's a number: 20 million. That's the low-end estimate of slaves in the world. No country is immune, and every place people look for trafficking, they find it. So we should look and act. And the sorts of analyses and practices that the transnational organized crime field has pioneered, methods that look at entire systems and complex relationships, should help guide our approach to this issue. For our part, the Obama administration has made this issue a top priority. And if you haven't seen President Obama's speech on this particular issue that he gave on September 25th in New York, I urge you to look it up. We've continued to do the things we know work: support for victims, robust victim identification, investigation and prosecution of traffickers, and as best an unwieldy bureaucracy can, we tried to innovate, like in our interagency coordination. Under Secretary Clinton's leadership as chair of our interagency task force, we've enhanced our cooperation among partner agencies to ensure our response here at home is more coordinated and effective. We're also looking at, and this is really exciting for a dork like me, combating modern slavery through procurement. In September, alongside his speech on modern slavery, the president signed a new executive order that will make sure the U.S. government procurement of goods and services isn't contributing to trafficking, and I think it can really be a model for other corporations. These types of approaches reflect the best information we have about this crime, but there are so many areas where the information we have isn't enough, where the gaps in our research and data represent zones of impunity where traffickers operate and exploit their victims. Now, we often say that trafficking is so underreported and perpetrators under-prosecuted and survivors underserved because it's a hidden crime, and that's true, but really every crime is a hidden crime. The truth, of course, is that criminals operate in the shadows of society, in shadows society creates and then ignores. And when it comes to our most vulnerable people, our world casts a long one. So we're left with an incomplete picture on a lot of area where we know modern slavery is a problem, like the business world. We know that the integrity of corporate supply chains is threatened when unscrupulous labor recruiters exact debts and ultimately control workers. And we know that slavery is rife in agriculture and mining that exists often beneath the opacity of commodities markets. As a result, it's virtually impossible to eat, drink, drive, or use any technology without touching the taint of slavery. We also know that there are best practices that corporations can take to get at this problem. They can know their contractors, recruiters, middlemen, carry out risk assessments, and know who they are hiring. But there's a lot that we don't know, too, and the nexus between the criminals that act to exploit these workers at the bottom end of the supply chain and where that intersects with legitimate business and where the criminal liability lies and corporate responsibility can engage, or there are flows of workers or particular commodities and trade routes that can get addressed in a way that would meaningfully change kind of the bigger numbers remains an open question and something that I think this community could really engage on. We also know that there's widespread migrant worker abuse, and that governments in both sending and receiving countries need to take this problem seriously. And I was recently in a country, and I work on this issue every day. I know it exists, and I quote the numbers. And I was in an entire airport terminal dedicated to returning migrant workers, and I can tell you there's nothing like seeing these rows of women lined up, waiting for their bags with their faces and the stories of abuse that continue to persist, and, you know, newspaper ads in surrounding countries that say, you know, if you act now, you can get an Indonesian-made 40% off on sale. That means modernizing immigration systems and ensuring government officials have a clear understanding of this crime and what it looks like. We have to move past the reactionary policies that would just restrict migration or view migrants as victims, ensuring that a more globalized economy and workforce does not usher in a new era of state-sponsored impunity. And again, we lack a real sense of, or at least quantifiable sense of, how trafficking in persons intersects with migrant flows or cross-sectoral analysis of emerging trends in destinations and origin, demographics, and policy. I could go on and on about areas where we just don't know enough. And when I told a friend I was going to be speaking here tonight, he said, it sounds like you're going to talk about the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And I thought, no, that's not what I want to do. But the truth is, how trafficking, whether legitimate business or safe migration, successful development, or effective promotion of democratic institutions, and how they intersect, prevent us from understanding the nature of trafficking more broadly. And as it relates to all of these areas, how is trafficking in migration tied to the exploitation that corrupts our supply chains? Or how the devastating effects of sex trafficking can undermine communities and derail development and democratization efforts? We can't connect the dots yet. Another such area relates to organized crime specifically. We know the Yakuza and the Zetas have engaged in human trafficking, but are these isolated incidents or crimes of opportunity, or is there a more strategic partnership and systemic cooperation? We know that members of the underground gangster Crips and MS-13 have been convicted of trafficking crimes, but again, we're not sure if those associations are related or coincidental. And we don't know as much as we would like to about trafficking-related foreign corruption, except that corruption is the grease that lubricates trafficking and other organized criminal activity. It can completely undermine a government's ability and even good faith efforts to deal with this crime. We know that there are links between trafficking in persons and numerous other transnational organized crimes, but we need more information about the details of those links and the relationships. And I think a lot of these gaps are due to, our funding on this issue globally, the funding on addressing these issues versus other transnational organized crimes. And so that's where you come in. The anti-trafficking movement is still relatively new, and unlike most movements, it didn't start with a groundswell of public support. This was something that Secretary Clinton heard about when she was First Lady, and a bill was passed. And now, 12 years in, fighting human trafficking on a scale equal to the crime requires simultaneous policy innovation, private sector leadership, civil society expertise, and grassroots mobilization. It requires scholars and researchers to help remedy the relative dearth of hard data and empirical research on this issue. I'm confident in the years ahead we'll begin to find the answers to a lot of these questions, and that the balance will shift from we don't know to we're making progress. But that's that's kind of contingent on continuing to talk about these types of issues in fora like this one, and not consistently relegating it to just a human rights issue. Though I think human rights issues shouldn't just be just human rights issues. The truth is that transnational organized crime will continue to demand a focus and command a nexus to security issues that do carry the day. So, thank you.
We are now going to turn to our panelists. Let me introduce them in the order in which we will hear from them. First, all the way to my right, we have Warda Henning, who is a Program Management Officer for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Prior to the UNODC, Ms. Henning worked at the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York, Sudan, South Sudan, and the UN Office of Legal Affairs. Before joining UN headquarters, Ms. Henning was an attorney with the law firms Covington & Burling and Clifford Chance. Prior to that, she worked at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in India, the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and Tanzania, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica, and the University of Amsterdam International Law Faculty. She holds degrees from Harvard Law School and is a Fulbright Scholar. Next, we have Joseph Evans, who recently retired after 20 years of service for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency as a regional director for North and Central America in Mexico City. In his post at the DEA, he conducted, directed, and was involved in complex investigations targeting major international drug trafficking organizations. Prior to that, he served as country attaché of the DEA in Caracas, Venezuela, as unit chief of the Special Operations Division, country attaché of the DEA in Panama City, and assistant special agent in charge of the DEA New York Field Division, where he was responsible for overseeing the activities of the DEA in Canada, Central America, and Mexico. He is a graduate of the University of Alabama and has been recognized for his efforts in furthering the U.S.-Mexico Joint Security Strategy toward combating drug trafficking and organized crime. We are also joined by Kathy Lynn Austin, who is the Executive Director of the Conflict Awareness Program, an internationally recognized expert on arms trafficking, peace and security, and human rights. For nearly 20 years, Ms. Austin has carried out original, precedent-setting, and in-depth field investigations into the illegal trade in weapons, illicit trafficking operations, illegal resource exploitation, transnational crime, and terrorism. She has documented conflicts spanning Africa, Latin America, East and Central Europe, and South Asia. Ms. Austin served with the UN Group of Experts on the DRC and Liberia, as well as chief of the Joint Mission Analysis Center for the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Timor-Leste and Burundi. She is also an accomplished writer and filmmaker and has a number of award-winning documentaries. And lastly, we have Justin Coslin, a product manager at Google Ideas, which is Google's think, do tank, focused on the intersection of technology and tough world challenges. Google Ideas believes that as illicit networks grow in scope and complexity, society's strategies to reduce their negative impact must draw on the power of technology. Mr. Coslin is a summa cum laude graduate of Yale University and has previously served as a product manager for Google News, Google AdSense for TV, and Google Docs. As a product manager, he works with engineers, designers, researchers, and marketers to design, prioritize, and launch new features and products. So each panelist will be given time between 6 and 8 minutes to discuss their experiences and personal accounts of the challenges that transnational organized crime pose to their respective organizations. And we will then open up the floor to audience participation for Q&A geared towards identifying areas of collaboration, best practices, and challenges to fighting the rise of transnational organized criminal networks. So why don't we get started?
Thank you very much to everyone, to the organizers. It's very good to be here and to see that a discussion is taking place on this issue. Also that a journal is dedicated to this issue, which of course, working in the Office on Drugs and Crime, I'm particularly grateful for, and it's very useful for us at the United Nations to work with the research that you all do. We don't always get a chance to say that out loud because of course we work with member states, we work mostly with the information we get from them, but we do very much rely on the academic community. So I wanted to say that to start. Let me briefly, since I have 6 to 8 minutes, I understand. The Office on Drugs and Crime is the office in headquarters at the United Nations that has the mandate to deal with transnational organized crime, illicit trafficking, including drug trafficking, human trafficking, migrant smuggling, small arms and light weapons, and then we also deal with terrorism, prevention and corruption. We also deal with piracy, but those were the four, I would say, first three main areas. And when I just heard Alice, and I'm grateful that you gave the very impressive speech that you did, because I would like to build on that and speak a little bit more about our work on human trafficking. The reason why I choose this topic, I know we're going to have some other topics here discussed also. The reason why I'd like to build on it is because at the New York Office of Drugs and Crime is mainly based in Vienna, but at the New York office we've seen more and more, a very small office, that member states have a very sincere interest ever since the Transnational Organized Crime Treaty went into force in 2003. And the protocol also in 2003 on human trafficking, member states have really started to understand the importance of this issue. In 2003, I think about 1/3 of the member states parties to that protocol on human trafficking had laws in place that would criminalize human trafficking, which in reality means that in those days, if you were caught as a prostitute or as a forced laborer, you would be the one on trial rather than the network that would actually worked behind forcing you to work there. And now in 2008, when we had our first global report on human trafficking came out in 2009, the numbers through 2008 indicated that 4/5 of the member states to that treaty now have laws in place criminalizing human trafficking. The membership to the protocol is 152 countries, so that's still a lot of countries that don't criminalize this practice. But then for the countries that do criminalize it, there are often issues with how they've drafted the law. And I think that's one of the main challenges we see. I thought I'd list 7 challenges, go through them very quickly, but that's the first one. We're really dealing with, first, countries that don't criminalize this practice. Second, countries that criminalize it, but the laws make it so difficult to prove this crime because you have to have so many layers of evidence, and the sensitive nature of the facts and victims that are often not willing to come forth and provide their testimony in court because they don't know what's going to happen to them afterwards. And they haven't actually seen that many people convicted of crimes in this area, so it's very difficult to get those details. That is what our office works with member states that request our technical assistance. We have a lot of lawyers working, going to law enforcement agencies, lawmakers, working with judges and prosecutors on how you can identify these crimes, what does it mean, how do you prioritize it, and how can you make sure that you actually catch the criminals, which are the organized crime networks that bring these people over, not the people who actually often show up in court because they were caught for prostitution or for example, labor without papers. That is, and then we have the implementation issue that once member states have the laws in place, even if they are drafted in such a way that it is possible to prosecute, we have law enforcement personnel again, judges and lawyers in many countries who are simply not trained on this issue. We work with them and train them with our partners, with member states, with the Department of State, with NGOs, with the private sector. That's another element that's very important, the coordination and the partnerships that everybody working in this area has together. These criminal networks, as mentioned, they're very sophisticated. They move very fast. Many of them have people in different locations, and they work based on local networks. They use languages, they use systems that we as foreigners may not be able to understand very quickly, and that even people from other areas within the same country may not be able to understand. So the only way to be ahead of those traffickers and try to figure out where their networks are and how they work is to really coordinate well and to cooperate well with the private sector, between countries, between member states, but also within the different departments of governments, for example, national governments, to make sure that they exchange information real time on these issues. What we see as another challenge is really that the issue is not made a priority. Again, law enforcement agencies very often are very male-dominated. There's also been comments from Professor Sharif Bassiouni, for example, who is an international criminal law professor at DePaul University. Someone who really is a war crimes expert. He's been all over the world, seen a lot, and he said that human trafficking to him is the human rights issue that governments have spoken about so much more than they've acted upon. He couldn't think of another. And he mentioned that since these law enforcement agencies are dominated by men, there's in many countries a kind of perception that prostitution either is tolerated or is somehow going to be there because it's always been there, and there are such other crimes that are more important. And he said, and that was impressive, he said this on the 3rd of April in the General Assembly when there was a debate on this issue. He said that that mindset, that really has to change. We need to work with the demand side of this crime. Why is it $32 billion a year made by illicit traffickers every year? That means there is a demand for these businesses. And in the case of sexual exploitation, would the persons who go and ask for these services still do this if they knew the likelihood that these persons were trafficked? These are issues that we all need to work on together, and that's not something only for member states. That's really from the grassroots level up. I will speak about one more issue, well, two more. One is the role of survivors. We call them survivors because there are, you may have heard of the Somali Mum Foundation or the Rani Hung Foundation. These are survivors of human trafficking who actually were freed, and they have set up NGOs, and they work with governments and policymakers, and we need to do that more. We've heard from them in discussions that policy is often made by persons who may have a hard time understanding what trafficking really is and what people are going through. They say, why are you talking about us? Why don't you speak with us? Help us help you make your policy. That is one of the lessons we learned in the UN. Women, but also men who have gone through these things themselves, who have been freed, and who are very willing to help to make sure that other people are not going through the same thing. We need to always think when we work, when we create policy, when we have meetings, that these people are in the room because they can actually tell us firsthand what we can expect and what we're looking at. And the final thing I would say is we already heard a little bit about the lack of data analysis and research that we have. The Office on Drugs and Crime has a mandate from the General Assembly to report on the status of human trafficking, to identify these networks. We will have an open debate launching the next human trafficking global report. I am quite sure that it's open to the public, so have a look out for that. And we also hope that you will get involved from your side. We need information, we need research, and we can use all the help we can get in fighting this crime.
My name is Joe Evans. To echo the comments of my colleagues here tonight, I'd like to thank Columbia University and the School of International and Public Affairs for the invitation to speak this evening, and especially with Ty McKeever and his invitation, all his hard work to put this forum together. I recently retired from DEA this past October. I currently work as the anti-money laundering, the director of the anti-money laundering risk analytics team for HSBC. And certainly tonight, the objective of my presentation is focused principally from my personal experience and observations while serving with DEA for over 20 years. It's not necessarily the official views of DEA nor HSBC, but essentially to share with you some of the things that I saw and learned from working principally international drug cartels that were operating from South, Central America, and Mexico that had direct impact upon the United States. I think the thing to remember when we talk about TCOs, they are a business enterprise. They don't necessarily have a philosophical or an ideological agenda like some terrorist organizations or other organizations out there. It's all about profit and power. They, like business, have a command and control structure. They have sophisticated communications and secure communications networks. They have a logistics structure depending on what they do, what illicit activity they're involved in. It could range from production, it could range from transportation, it could range to detail or retail distribution. And of course, because they're in it for the money, they have a financial structure because it's all about the repatriation of those illicit monies back to the organization members so they can spend it. These organizations thrive off of weakness that exists in states at local levels, international levels. It may be, for example, corruption. It could be a weak judicial system. It could be weakened or corrupt security forces. And it certainly could be driven by a whole host of other factors, such as socioeconomic factors that exist in certain countries. Finally, as we've seen the world become more globalized, they have. We've seen them diversify where traditional or organizations who may have been traditionally involved solely in drug trafficking have become involved in other crimes, and it may be fraud. It could be, we've seen drug trafficking organizations not only be involved in other illicit activities that facilitate their illegal enterprise, such as gun trafficking, for example, but also diversify into things like international property rights violations and fraud, piracy. So they have become more diversified, and they become more mobile as technology has allowed us to become more mobile, whether it's the ability to travel throughout a certain region or around the world, or communicate in a better, more secure fashion. They have learned how to harness that. And so law enforcement and prosecutors and other security focuses, or security forces, attempt to focus on these enterprises in terms of that business model and almost in terms of what you could call like a hostile takeover. We try to attack through investigations, prosecutions, and interdiction the supply chain, the command and control, the financial structure. We want to break that down. We want to seize their assets. So it's a multi-pronged approach in terms of law enforcement, but there's also a very good understanding about some of the other greater factors that exist, social issues and economic issues that help drive this problem. And you see that every day as law enforcement and other folks, whether it's in the Department of State, whether it's in other NGO type organizations outside of government, whether it's in the private sector, who all sit down and they look at this problem and they exchange ideas and they figure out ways to work together to, again, come at the problem in as many different approaches as possible and really try to get down into the roots of the problem and look for the long-term solution, because a police solution alone is probably not your best answer. So it has to be a very broad approach. It's a very complex problem, and certainly governments around the world understand it. But again, a lot of them are dealing with very complex problems themselves, and just to have some of the resources to attack the problem, they themselves find themselves in a difficult situation. However, the good news is there certainly is dialogue, and again, people are talking about the problem, and I would say from the law enforcement context, the level of information and intelligence sharing is occurring like it's never occurred before. Many of the suspicions between partner law enforcement around the world has lowered, and you see these folks working closer and working much more effectively together. Because it is important, we have to utilize each other's jurisdictions, investigative authorities, and ability to prosecute to go after these organizations wherever they may exist. Because if you just pull them apart in one place, you know, like they say, it's like pushing the balloon. You hit the supply routes one place, they're going to look for an alternative. So we have to approach it in that context. I think, again, just in closing, when you look at the success the United States made over the years targeting the Italian mafia, going back almost a century, you look at the success, and it's not perfect, but the success that was achieved in Colombia, and you look at Mexico and the fact that it is very violent, and in a lot of times when you attack these TCOs, it produces that reaction. But they have, little by little, made headway in attacking the leadership and breaking them down. And I think they're on their way to taking this from being a strategic problem to a local policing problem. And that's really what the objective is there. So, so that closes my comments.
Thank you very much. I want to join my fellow panelists in thanking Columbia University and also the organizers who put this event together, and especially the journal editors for producing such a cutting-edge publication. So congratulations for this publication that I assume is outside for people to pick up. First, I have to make a disclaimer. There is a legal arms trade. And whereas there's a lot of people in the world who believe that that needs itself to be regulated, there is a movement afoot to bring the legal arms trade into compliance or to conformity with international human rights and international law standards. There is a process that's taking place. It's a movement to put for member states of the UN to negotiate an arms trade treaty, and that arms trade treaty negotiations will start up again in March. So for those who are wanting to sort of track what is happening in the legal trade, that's a good place to start. I'm going to talk about the illegal trade. So again, the disclaimer is there's a legal trade. The other two elements that make up the illicit trade are the black market trade, which are profiteers who do basically operate solely as a lifestyle choice for power or for profit. And then there's the gray market trade, which is when governments rely on illicit operators in order to carry out national security operations. Those two trades overlap, and it's one of the reasons why the legal trade is unique, or the arms middlemen are uniquely unregulated. And that, I think, is why we find ourselves faced and confronted with this problem of illicit traffickers. For someone who has tracked arms traffickers my entire professional career, I started in 1989 in Angola and Namibia, I saw for myself how a lot of this wave of arms trafficking entrepreneurs began precisely at the end of the Cold War. What happened was, at the end of the Cold War, a lot of individuals who had worked for governments inherited the transport networks, inherited contacts on the ground in the war zones they'd operated, and they began to pick it up as a private business. So with globalization and privatization at the end of the Cold War, that's where we began to see these these privateers, private arms traffickers really beginning to take root. Today, I have to say that most of the arms traffickers, the big kingpins, are the same ones that have been around this long. They're household names to law enforcement agents, to UN Security Council arms trafficking and sanctions monitors, and yet we've seen very few prosecuted. The bad news is that they have been able to operate with impunity because there are very few international law enforcement regimes set up to curtail their lethal business. One of the reasons, as I mentioned, is because these arms traffickers are often employed by governments. And Victor Boot, who has become sort of the poster boy for the illicit gun runner, he was one of the characters that the Lord of War movie was based upon. He ran 140 sorties for the U.S. Department of Defense during the Iraq War before he was chased by the U.S. Department of the DEA for narco trafficking. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of why these entities are able to operate outside of most law enforcement regimes. So just for the sake of brevity, I'm going to use Victor Boot as an example to illuminate how we might be able to go after these arms traffickers through the lens of a transnational crime enforcement regime. For 15 years, basically, Victor Boot operated in African war zones, Colombia, Afghanistan, you named it, and he remained at large. As I had mentioned, it took the DEA in the U.S. Several years ago to develop a narco trafficking charge to actually go after him, a link to terrorism. So Victor Boot was not prosecuted, even though he's been listed on UN sanctions list for many years. He's been his activities have been well documented. There was no international law enforcement regime that could actually be utilized to bring him to justice. And so it took a sting operation, and it took potential terrorism charges to bring him to book. What that meant is that even though one of the world's biggest arms traffickers was taken out of the equation, it did nothing for us in terms of setting any precedent for going after arms traffickers in terms of what kind of law enforcement tools to use, but also for setting any precedent for international crimes, such as war crimes, or for motivating governments to tighten their laws on how they should be dealing with these particular arms middlemen. It also means that since it's sort of not addressed from a transnational crime perspective, when assets are frozen, particularly under UN regimes, and in the case of Victor Boot, allegedly $6 billion have been frozen, none of those proceeds are repatriated back to any victims or back to any victimized communities. But I think worse, with Victor Boot remaining at large, even though he was sort of this poster boy within the UN and amongst different governments, it kind of gave the impression that that arms traffickers basically existed above the law. And so once Victor Boot was arrested and arrested for terrorism, that same kind of mentality has existed. It also sort of law enforcement and UN agencies were able to say, look, they kind of washed their hands saying we've taken the biggest kingpin out of the equation. There's nothing else for us to be concerned about. This is basically where organizations like the Conflict Awareness Project comes in. After Victor Boot was sentenced, and that's been less than a year, one of the things that we began to notice was that there was very little activities from a law enforcement perspective to go after other arms traffickers. And time again, when I was invited to speak to the media, for example, on the whole question of Victor Boot, I was asked, well, who was filling his shoes? Who's taking his place? Is there anyone else out there? And I wanted to be able to answer that question. So our organization raised the funds to go out and look to see what Victor Boot's successors were doing, what his lieutenants, what his networks were doing, because it was clear to us that certainly these kinds of networks don't go away overnight when you arrest just one of the particular kingpins. And so last May, we went out on an extensive investigation, and we were able to, as an NGO, with forensic documentation and collection of evidence, actually detail the chain of supply and the pipeline of Victor Boot's successors. We found them operating on the island of Mauritius, which had been the model for good governance in Africa. So they were corrupting this particularly good state. And they had set up operations, transnational operations, that were moving across multiple borders in order to bring traffic weapons into the Congo, Sudan, Iran, all under UN sanctions regimes, with nobody minding the shop. And just to give you an example, which I think is very important, of the transnational nature of this particular criminal network. Basically, they depended on a Bangor, Maine, American airport servicing company in order to acquire aircraft. They leased aircraft from a Finnish company. They used an aviation broker in the UK. They used a financial agent in the Channel Islands. They used South African servicing and insurance companies to secure their networks. They had money laundering activities out of the United Arab Emirates. So that gives you an example, an idea of how tricky it is to fight this particular kinds of organization when all of these elements are taking place over numerous borders. It's an enormous task and challenge for any particular law enforcement agent to go after. Just to conclude, one of the things that sort of the bad news is that, as I mentioned, is that there's really no one minding the shop. The good news is that we are beginning to try to build momentum within, just to use the United States, for example, for law enforcement agencies, for policymakers, for different U.S. agencies to start going after this kind of network using the Transnational Criminal Organization terms of reference, which they have not taken this approach in the past. So what we are proposing is that rather than just designate some of these arms trafficking kingpins as sanctions violators, to begin to designate them as criminal kingpins, which puts them on a U.S. designated list, which will continue momentum in terms of using U.S. Or using international compliance software to go after them. It creates a longevity for how long they are put on these lists so that law enforcement agents can continue to pursue them. It just provides a new enforcement tool that has never been used before in going after international arms traffickers. So as an NGO, while we will continue to push for precedent case against an arms trafficker to be prosecuted for war crimes, which has not been done before, we are also trying to get governments around the world and the United Nations to start designating these illicit arms traffickers that are fueling conflicts and wars and that are violating UN sanctions, to begin to go after them as international criminal organizations.
Good evening, folks. I'd like to thank our organizers and also thank all of you for coming out on a Friday night. I hope it wasn't under threat of force, fraud, or coercion. My name is Justin. I work at Google, a part of Google called Google Ideas, focused on our illicit networks focus area. Now, I'd like to ask you, when you hear illicit networks, what do you think? Name some organizations that come to mind. Al-Qaeda, okay, I'm sorry. Enron? Oh, okay. Please.
I did have some question about
Oh, I'll get into that. Don't worry. Yeah, I'm just curious. When you think of illicit networks specifically. Oh, don't worry. There'll be time for Q&A.
Okay, then I'll just pay.
Okay, thank you, sir. So illicit networks range quite broadly. They include the Zetas, or organized crime in Latin America. They include small-scale human trafficking organizations in Nepal and Dubai. They include, in some cases, the Vietnamese army, which is involved in the $15 billion annual illicit timber trade. If you were trying to get smart on illicit networks and understand how technology could play a constructive role, what might your first step be? Google it. Good answer. So I joined the team in February, and my first step was to do a bunch of Googling. And then we convened a number of folks with expertise in different forms of illicit networks in a big summit in Los Angeles. And so we had survivors. We had folks who had been smuggled out of North Korea in the last couple of years. We had human labor survivors. We had forced sex worker survivors, including one who was a forced sex worker right here in the United States from ages 11 to 17, which is pretty horrific. We had folks in the technology world, from the nonprofit world, the Secretary General of Interpol, and really tried to understand holistically, how do these networks operate? The reality today is that they actually don't operate in a siloed fashion. So the Zetas in Mexico, who I mentioned earlier, today only make, by some estimates, 40% of their revenue from drugs. The other 60% is everything from illicit arms to human trafficking to all sorts of black market activities. And so in a world where illicit networks become more and more connected to each other, you have to ask the question, how can technology connect the good guys to each other and connect the good guys to information? So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples of projects that we're working on at Google Ideas, which may address your question, sir, that hopefully will make a dent in the long term. Now, one point worth noting before I go into the 3 projects, today there are about 1 billion people connected to the internet. If you play it out a decade or two, it'll probably be somewhere between 4 and 5 billion people connected to the internet. That's a huge number of people, many of whom will be connecting to the first time on mobile devices, not laptops or desktops. And so we ask the question, what can you do in that world? And what can you start doing now so that when we get to that world, we'll know how technology can be a force for good? So let me talk about a couple projects. The first one I'm going to talk about is a project we're supporting in the Mekong Delta. It's being driven by a great nonprofit there called the Mekong Club. And what it is an Android app for maritime police. So we've heard a couple great stories tonight about workers who may board a fishing boat not knowing that they're going to be slaves. But when they get on that boat, and by the way, they had to pay to get on that boat. They had to pay a labor recruiter for the right to get on a boat and possibly become a forced worker. And when they get on that boat, their papers are confiscated. They're forced to take amphetamines. They're working 15-hour days. They're not being paid what they were promised. They're not being let off. And they're kept on that boat for a couple years until their bodies don't work anymore, and then they're let off at whatever port is convenient for the boat owner. It's pretty horrific. What's interesting is that during the course of those couple years, the boat's going to be boarded by maritime police at least once, sometimes twice. And so the boat owners will take that boat out of the territorial waters where the fishermen were recruited and to a different country that doesn't speak the language. So if I'm a Cambodian fisherman and I get on a boat, the boat could go to Thailand, to New Zealand, somewhere like that. And so when the Thai maritime police board that boat, I'm not going to understand what they're asking me, and I'm not going to trust them. It's a bunch of bulky Thai dudes, in armor. I've never seen these guys before. I don't recognize them. I'm not going to trust them. So here's what the app is. Let's say, sir, that you are a member of the Thai Maritime Police, and you board a boat where I'm working. What you would do is you would take out your Android phone, you'd boot up the app, and you hold out the screen in front of me. And I see a list of country names and flags. And hopefully I recognize one as my own, so I tap it. At that point, a video starts to play of a woman from my culture, in my language, asking me simple yes or no questions like, are you being paid? Do you want to get off the boat right now with the guy holding this phone? And after every question, there's a big yes button, and there's a big no button. And I can tap whichever one reflects my opinion of reality. And so even though we don't speak the same language, even though I may not trust you, I can still communicate to you that something is wrong, and you know enough that you can get me off that boat where the professional translator can help sort through the issue. You also can use the app to take testimony, take evidence, so that if you try to prosecute the boat owner, you have some sort of day of documentary evidence. Does that make sense? So that's one example of a project we're working on. I'll give a couple more examples. We're a think-do tank. And so that means we do some projects that are practical, like the one I just alluded to, and some that are more researchy. On the research side, we're interested in arms flows because arms are one tool that pretty much every illicit network needs to use in order to maintain force and control. What's interesting is that most illicit arms were not manufactured to be illicit arms. They were manufactured to be licit, to be legal. And at some point, they were siphoned off the legal arms trade into the hands of bad actors. And so we took some data, some ComTrade data, which is basically UN data that was provided to the UN by member nations based on customs declarations forms. And in this case, the data was sanitized by the PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and the Agape Institute. And we basically brought it to life. So when you get home, if you use your favorite search engine, whatever that is, and you do a search for Google Ideas Small Arms or Google Small Arms Visualization or any terms like that, they'll be able to see this visualization that we created in partnership with a part of Google called the Creative Lab. You know they're creative because the word creative is right there in the name. And what it does is it takes 2 decades worth of arms transfer data and brings it to life. And so you can see for every country what have been the ebbs and flows in civilian weapons, in ammunition, in declared military weapons over those 2 decades. You can see when Mexico's drug war takes off, where are they getting the new guns from? Where are guns going to? And you can also get a sense of how large the ammunition trade is. Because let's face it, without ammo, a gun is just a big wooden and metal stick. It might look a little bit threatening, but it's not actually going to help you maintain order. You know, in some cases, I believe, if you look at the globe, if memory serves, I might be wrong, Spain in 2010 exported $100 million worth of ammunition. And I think about 1/10 of that in actual weapons. And so we view these research projects as a way to help inform the debate, not to take a side in it, but just to show that data can help inform the way that we think about some of these issues. I'm going to talk about one last project we're working on. Another commonality across all these different illicit networks is that they thrive on secrecy. Whenever an investigative journalist goes out and figures out who's really behind a shell company or who really is pulling the strings on a project, and they publish that, it's incredibly disruptive for the illicit network because it brings pressure from government, from private sector. You know, in some cases, hotels will not book room to somebody who's been recently exposed as an illicit figurehead. It's almost a quality of life issue, if nothing else. And so there's a great group of journalists out of Eastern Europe called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Are you familiar with them? Oh, excellent. And what they've realized is that a lot of shell companies are incorporated in a relatively small number of countries. Luxembourg, Panama, Cyprus, the Virgin Islands, about a dozen countries in all. And so, for example, if you're curious why only one telco in Azerbaijan was able to get a 3G license while its competitors weren't and withered away, you could do a search in their database for the name of the shell company that owns that one telco that got the license. And the top result, if you opened it, you can do this today. It says called the investigative dashboard. We had nothing to do with it. If you do that today and look at the top result, you'll see it's a Panama incorporation record of Houston Management, which is the name of the shell company. And right there on the document, the president and the treasurer are the 2 daughters of the first family of Azerbaijan. Right. And so we see tremendous power in investigative journalism as a tool against illicit networks. And we've been working with that community to try to figure out how you can amplify that approach. And so we don't have any finished projects there yet. But hopefully if I talk to you again in 6 months, I'll have more to share. So I'll stop there, but I hope that you took away one basic point, which is that technology can be connective. It can connect bad people to bad resources, but it can also connect our community to folks who can make a difference on the ground and to information that can inform the way we think. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all of these illuminating comments. I am going to take the prerogative as the chair to put a couple of questions out to the panel first, and then we're going to open it up. So I have three kind of interrelated questions, and whichever one of you feels comfortable answering, I'd love to get your thoughts. I'm wondering first, to what extent in each of your areas of work you have witnessed a series of unintended or perverse consequences as a result of going after organized crime. So for example, Pardis Mahdavi, who's a scholar who studies trafficking, has talked about in the discourse on trafficking that adult male migrant laborers, for example, in the Middle East, who are not female sex workers, are sometimes left out of the category of those who are trafficked, and therefore kind of marginalized from a regime that is otherwise meant to protect their rights. In this journal issue, Frank Madsen and others who've written about Central America write about the project of counter-narcotics and describe the degree to which policies and programs that go after drug traffickers have generated in response entire criminal and violent political economies that wreak havoc on the lives of ordinary people who get caught up in the drug war. Similarly, in my own experience and colleagues of mine who study Afghanistan, we see Afghan farmers who have been left really without any livelihoods as a result of aggressive counter-narcotics policies implemented by the government in Afghanistan, which is trying to deliver so-called poppy-free provinces to the donor community. So I'm wondering, again, if you can reflect a bit on this phenomenon of consequences that come from going after organized crime that are unintended and sometimes result in and produce harm. The second question related is wondering to what extent, if at all, the delineation of a particular behavior or a particular individual as a crime or as a criminal is sometimes challenging. So I, for example, study warlord governors in Afghanistan, and I think it's debatable, and that's a debate for another day, the degree to which these men are more governors or are they more criminals. So I would argue that they could be both, but others might disagree, and there's a lot of scope for debate. So I was just, reading and preparing for this about how the United States government has identified several godfathers of the Japanese Yakuza, the organized criminal syndicate, as part of a new sanctions regime, which is aimed at targeting transnational criminal organizations. And yet, if you read about these organizations in the context of Japanese life, you see that these are men who operate above ground and are very much a part of political, economic, and social life in Japan. So an article this fall in the Daily Beast, for example, described how one of the organizations that's been targeted by this new U.S. policy contributed, for example, significantly to relief efforts after the Japanese earthquake. So I'm wondering if one country's criminal is another country's business tycoon or political heavyweight or even local philanthropist. And is it reasonable to be relativist in that way, or are there certain universal standards that all governments have come to agree with that, yes, this is in fact a criminal organization and we should take it on? And the last question I would ask is, for those of us who study organized crime from a historical perspective, we know that organized criminals throughout history have always preyed on ordinary people. But we also know that they have sometimes provided them with protection, with goods and services, with political power, and with economic opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. So I'm wondering to what extent you see that in the organizations that you have looked at, the sort of dark side, but also sometimes modes of order and service and goods provision that might not otherwise be there or provided to them by a government. And how do you kind of reconcile that with your missions to kind of take these organizations down or disrupt their work?
When we're talking about kind of our personal connection to slavery and the existence of human trafficking tainting really almost every consumer good, almost always people's first reaction is, who's awful and how do I boycott? And that approach, both from a government, corporate, and also individual perspective, actually does nothing to help the people on the ground that we're trying to help. You pull out of a country, you stop purchasing, you boycott a corporation, the corporation then pulls out of a country. The reality is that those people don't wind up any more free. The situation is more economically depressed, and now there's no incentive to change the structure. There was a good example here that was relayed to me, and all of the caveats that you can expect with a bureaucrat talking about what's happening with the implementation of prostitution policy here in New York City. People rightfully thought that understanding that force, fraud, and coercion are frequently present in prostitution, that women who are arrested for prostitution should get less of a criminal penalty than the Johns who are purchasing. So now there's kind of a two-tiered criminal structure that's arguably feminist in its approach. But what winds up happening in the practical application of it is that with the broken windows theory of crime policy, there's an incentive to get the types of tickets, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to jumble the words, but there's an incentive to get those types of misdemeanors, and I think last I heard, and the law may have been changed since we last spoke about this, prostitution in New York City was kind of the criminal equivalent of hopping a subway turnstile and incentivized for promotion. And purchasing a commercial sex service was much higher. And what we were hearing from the women in the city was cops don't want to do the paperwork for the bigger one that isn't tied to a promotion. And so frequently they will arrest the women, send the Johns on their way. Now the court system is inundated with all of these prostitution charges, and the courts can't tolerate it, so what the prosecutors are being told is get a guilty plea and commute the sentence. And so now all of these women are not being properly screened for trafficking, they're not getting interviewed, and they have criminal records such that they can't be hired. So that's the answer to your first question. I'm going to dodge on the third question, and then on the second question, it makes me want to take your classes, and I think it's a really interesting question. I do fundamentally believe that, particularly related to trafficking in persons, but impoverished and vulnerable people the world over are often the last ones to have, the rule of law extended to them. And we spend almost all of our diplomatic energy in our office explaining to folks that trafficking in persons is a crime, it needs to be prosecuted, and it isn't enough just to do a public awareness campaign. And I do think the crime framing is very helpful in and I would be interested in other UNODC's thoughts on this, but in taking the shame out of the trafficking in persons equation. I mean, I remember going to a UNODC ARIA on the connection between trafficking in persons and organized crime, and one of the country representatives at the table said, of course, we all want to be a transit country because there's no shame in that. If you're an origin or a source country, that's embarrassing. And the truth of the matter is, you know, if the crime is happening, the question is not whether or not it's happening, it's how you deal with it. So I think there is a basic importance to keeping that element in.
So on the subject of the Yakuza, a friend of mine used to be a bartender in Japan, and he realized that the bar was owned by the Yakuza when one of the regulars cut off another guy's finger with a katana. So I agree that they're mostly benign, but not entirely. Three questions is probably too much for me to be able to remember on a Friday night, but I'm pretty sure I remember the first one, so I'll respond to that. In Rio, in the favelas, you have an interesting case study in law enforcement with unintended side effects. So the favelas there are basically these shanty towns that have existed, in some cases, for 100 years. And they're historically ruled by local gangs and militias with names like the Red Command. That particular one, incidentally, started ideologically as communist and gradually became just another money-making cartel. So the victory of capitalism, I suppose. And the traditional police model there was to periodically send in cops with guns on raids and go in and shoot some guys and get shot at, and maybe you die too, and declare victory, and then lather, rinse, repeat. And it didn't really solve the problem at all. You did have occasional fatalities of gang leaders, but at the end of the day, the territory was still controlled by the gangs. And in order to enter a favela, you had to get the permission of the ruling gangs. In fact, in some cases, killing a gang leader just sparks a war for succession, making the favela more violent, not less violent. There is a silver lining in this case, though. A few years ago, there was a new police unit called the UPP, the Unit of Pacification Police, that was established. Actually, the commander of the UPP, Colonel Robson, is interviewed in the issue of the magazine that just came out. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. He's a really interesting guy. But the philosophy of this new police unit is a radical break from the past. It's 30% women. All of the police, as part of their training, go to a maternity ward and hold babies. They run ballet classes. They do sightseeing trips with kids in the favela through the city. It's really community-oriented policing. It's almost borrowing sort of a page from the Coin book, the sort of counterinsurgency book. And in the favelas where these new UPP have been deployed, it's been quite successful. So I think that what the story started as a bad case study in sort of law enforcement with bad side effects, but I think they have really innovated and found a way to have a positive impact. Now, the interesting question that remains to be seen is what role can technology, especially mobile technology, play in promoting accountability and trust and communication for these new police?
I think in terms of the unintended consequences, I mean, I do look at Victor Boot's trial again just because it's fairly well known. And that trial, the conviction, the sentencing, resulted from a sting operation. Now, that took an evil person out of the equation, but it also meant that we began to lose the public relations war outside of the United States. A lot of countries are very concerned about the U.S. applying terrorism charges territorially to their citizens abroad. And so the Victor Boot issue is brought up in every single meeting with the Russian government, between the United States and Russian government, and it has cost us a lot of alliances overseas. The other sort of more notable one in the United States is the Fast and Furious. I think many people are aware of that. But again, that's because it was based on a sting operation. It was based on a type of operation of going after entities, possibly trying to entrap them, rather than going after entities for crimes where there is accumulated evidence and knowledge of what those activities are. In regards to goods and services, again, just coming back to Victor Boot, that's going to be my theme tonight. One of the things that Moscow argued consistently about Victor Boot was that he had 140 aircraft operating. He had employed a number of Russian pilots and Russian aircraft servicemen after the end of Afghanistan, after the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. So he was employing a number of Russian citizens abroad, and he was making a lot of money for a lot of different individuals. However, if you look at the consequences on the ground, if you look at wars in the Congo and Sierra Leone and the sort of accumulated deaths and misery, and also in terms of the amount of foreign aid and humanitarian aid that's gone into the countries, I think you'll see it greatly reduced. But also, if you Google Victor Boot's planes, you'll see that a lot of, almost an enormous amount of these planes crashed. And a lot of those who were employed died. And one of the reasons why Victor Boot was so successful in creating this huge enterprise was because he paid those pilots so little. And that was one of the reasons why he was able to undercut a lot of his competitors.
I think in terms of unintended consequences, or maybe more in terms of, you could call it unanticipated consequences, when looking at Mexico, was when President Calderon and the government kicked off their strategy to target the leadership of the drug cartels. The way the violence spiked, and the consequences that were related to that. And I think it was more due to maybe a lack of understanding of capacity with state and local police forces, because Mexico, like the United States, you know, it is federalist. There is a separation between local, state, and federal in terms of law enforcement and prosecutions. So when you look at, in terms of many of the crimes that the Zetas commit up in the northeastern part of the country, a lot of those crimes would fall under the state, not necessarily the federal government. And so because of the weakness that existed there in terms of having the capacity to effectively investigate those crimes, to have the capacity to effectively prosecute those crimes, as the leadership was attacked and those organizations would splinter, and then really become a responsibility of the state more than the federal government. There was that clear inability for state and local law enforcement and prosecutors to tackle the problem. And it's not again, an easy solution. So you're talking, as really the focus was building up the federal forces to be able to tackle this problem. There was, again, a blind eye towards the state and local piece, and now they're sort of focusing on that, trying to catch up with that understanding that without those folks, without those state and local interlocutors and partners in law enforcement and in the judicial system, it'll be very challenging to get a lot of that violence under control.
About the unintended consequences, the thing that came to mind to me is the case of the Netherlands, where I am from and where I hear from friends who work in law enforcement that they actually have quite a progressive human trafficking law there in place. And what they're doing over there is raids on institutions where they believe or suspect that there's a lot of people that are there as a result of trafficking. And they explain to those people their rights, and the word has gotten out among trafficked persons that they do get the protection. An adverse result is that they're getting a lot of people who go voluntarily to the police and say, I was trafficked, and now the police has to do investigations, really research, and they want to give everybody due process and fair trial, and they do, but that's going to take away resources that they may have used elsewhere. It's, you know, it's an example country, so it's good to see how that works out, but that's one thing that came to mind. You asked about universal standards versus whatever may in reality locally sometimes work, let's put it that way. As a UN person, we get these discussions in different areas all the time. We have universal standards, but in our case, we work with member states at their request They ask us for assistance. They give us the mandate. So we really make sure that local ownership, and I suspect that here at CIPA you're all very familiar with that principle, national ownership and local ownership. We work with what governments ask us to work with. That's why we're there. That's the principle upon which we work. Having said that, there are certain universal standards. What we try to do in cases where we think there might be both, we look at, for example, the Convention Against Corruption, which is a convention that has a lot of states parties. We find areas where everybody agrees that we can tackle very practically. So we'll look at corruption, try to fight that in those countries to kind of avoid having to have that discussion, because it's an important discussion, but you can't always have it because it may not always be relevant what the outcome is, as long as you sort of get the job done practically. And in the area of corruption, which has such an impact on many other areas, transnational organized crime, that is one place where I always think we can make progress, and it's not that uncontroversial. Oh yeah, just a small point on alternative development. You mentioned Afghanistan, and we've also seen it in Myanmar about the poppy seeds. When you indeed work to eliminate a trade, really, it's very important, of course, to think about alternatives. It happened initially when all these sweatshop shops, maybe 20, 30 years ago, came out more in the open. That children would end up going back to those sweatshops because they had to provide for their families. And then governments realized that they have to put in place an alternative program like school or another way for these kids to bring money home. And then, you know, with a long-term prospect, you can fight these things. So in the case of poppy seeds at the UNODC, we actually have something called alternative development, where we work with farmers and make sure that they have an agricultural or another area where they can work, so that they know the day that they stop this practice, they have somewhere else to go where they can also make money and make a living. But of course they need training in that too, and that's resources. So yeah.
A specific question more around the Google idea. So a lot of the services that Google provides can be used by these illicit networks as well. And is Google looking at sort of, in a way, creating filters that actually can aid law enforcement? Because my emails get scanned for ads, you know. And is Google thinking about expanding its intelligence, data intelligence, to potentially aid the colleagues next to us? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mari Carmen, first year MPA student, and this question goes particularly to Mr. Evans. And I'm curious to hear more about what the United States is doing internally in disrupting criminal organizations. And this question goes beyond, because in the last 3 years or more, when we read about the drug trafficking organizations in the United States, they say Mexican organizations. And it seems that the United States does not acknowledge that the problem is also here, and people that it's trafficking these drugs are actually American, and in non-official document that is acknowledged. So I'm curious just to hear what's the perspective with that, and also about corruption in the border, particularly in the case of El Paso, Texas, because it seems that the United States is it brags about how El Paso is the second safest city in the United States, but in Mexico, Ciudad Juarez is actually the most dangerous city in Latin America, and the same amount of drugs that makes Ciudad Juarez the most dangerous city is the one that makes, is the same amount of drugs that cross to El Paso. So it seems to be some sort of situation there.
So technology has always been and will always be a double-edged sword. One way of thinking about the goal of my group, and I should mention that my group does not have a profit and loss. We're not a money-making part of the company. We're a cousin of Google.org, which is the traditional philanthropic part of Google. And one way you could think about the mission of my group is to make sure that in the long run, technology is more a force for good than for ill. There is a significant chunk of the company that interfaces with law enforcement requests as appropriate. I'm not the expert on that. But I'm happy afterwards if I can help put you in touch with somebody who can answer any questions you have.
Okay, regarding my questions, yeah, I think sometimes the labeling and the branding it ends up landing on the organizations as where their command and control structure exists. So when you look back, whether it's the Italian Mafia, when you look back with the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel, for example, they were Colombian drug cartels. Their, so to speak, headquarters unit was based out of Cali, Colombia, or Medellin, Colombia. And certainly, like any business operation, although their headquarters component was, existed in that country, like with looking at the Mexican drug cartels, retail distribution, the majority of it is occurring here in the United States. And so I think it's a bit of that branding. But certainly that, without those retail distributors and without that function, without people who are able to pick up the money and repatriate that back, whether they have to push it through financial institutions or it goes back in bulk currency, they're all part of that organization. And so a bunch of guys get rounded up in a trailer park in Atlanta, and that, the thing that comes out is, yes, it was, part of the La Familia drug cartel, when the majority of them were just local guys. And so, but it was that attachment, the fact that they maybe received their product for distribution ultimately from La Familia. And so a lot of times you'd see that branding. In terms of the corruption issue, there are things that all law enforcement agencies, all political structures deal with. And in certain places, obviously public corruption is a much greater problem because of maybe lack of rule of law or other factors. But it does exist, and it requires a robust internal affairs program and different mechanisms to try to combat that. And so one of them that you saw in Mexico is the fact with the new Mexican Federal Police Force, they established requirements for their onboarding, which involve polygraph, which involve more like similar to the business community with KYC, going out, finding out, talking to the neighbors, looking at the background of their candidates, looking to see, what their education levels were, trying to pay them more and get candidates that were college graduates and those things to try to help combat that. But it all boils down to the fact that you'd go back and you'd look at these police forces, and a lot of them couldn't feed their families, and a lot of them were living in neighborhoods where they themselves, their own security was in jeopardy. So it is an issue that continually needs to be looked at and addressed, and I think certainly in Mexico they're making headway in combating that. And the third question was?
It was more like the United States, what the United States is doing regarding the corruption in the other side of the border, because especially when they have, when they're like bilateral unions, and the United States is always saying
how corrupt Mexico is and how the police can really don't do anything about it, but they never mention the other side.
Well, what you've seen in Mexico, a lot of the things they've done is adopt the practices not only of U.S. law enforcement, but the law enforcement community, the international law enforcement community in general. So recently, I think prior to my departure, for example, the Attorney General, she set up a program to go through and vet all her prosecutors, for example, to looking for corruption, those types of things. As I was heading out, I think she fired over 2,000 prosecutors that could not meet that vetting standard. So you hear a lot more of it from there, but I think it's because it's much more significant in the fact that because they're taking these steps to combat the problem, you'll hear the federal police fired almost 3,000 police candidates and new officers that couldn't pass the vetting. So I think that's part of the reason you hear a lot more about it, because they're really trying to be very aggressive and proactive in that. and there's a lot of news about it.
Sorry, I just wanted to say something about the digital age to get back to your question. As an investigator who collects evidence for criminal prosecutions, one of the things that has been our biggest break in recent years is email traffic. Because email traffic also illuminates an intent to commit a crime. So as an investigator going out in the past and trying to get the, the human person who will come forward and testify, you get those email traffics, one lucky break, and you're able to go after an entire organization. The other thing is bank transactions, or transactions to combat money laundering, for example. So you no longer need Bank of America to hand over banking records. Individuals can keep these records themselves. And so again, if you get a lucky break, you can get to the bottom of an entire financial transaction without even having to go through the privacy issues of a institution.
Hi, my name is Andrea Moore. This question is from a remark that Allison Friedman you made, but it's open to anyone. You said that there's more and more being done in terms of hard data collecting, and I was just curious to hear about maybe some of the initiatives and maybe public-private partnerships that are required of collecting some of this data, how it's maybe shared among organizations. It's hard to collect data on things that are out in the open. So for something that is intentionally hidden, what kinds of data collection is able to be done for some of these hard numbers that you were referring to?
I was wondering, this is for all of you, to what degree do your various organizations interact and share information? Because obviously networks that deal with transnational organized crime are not mutually exclusive, and often each organization has its own priority, and finding evidence on other areas of organized crime can fall by the wayside. So to what degree do you communicate among each other, and to what degree do you not?
Thank you for the questions. Two examples, and I can get you more, and I'm happy to give you my card afterwards, about good data collection that I think could be modeled and kind of extended more broadly. The United Nations Interagency project. The acronym is UNIAP, but they were doing what's called sentinel surveillance in the Mekong Delta. So interviewing people who had been deported about what their experience had been, and we were able to get a lot of concrete data out of kind of what the incidence was of trafficking in returning migrants, and they also did some really interesting reports on returning fishermen, and I think 1 in 10 had witnessed a murder on board. I mean, really interesting data coming from there. The International Organization for Migration repatriated over 500 domestic workers from a Middle East country, and was able to, and in a country where the law did not allow for socializing outside. I mean, these were people who were basically restricted to their home. And when they were repatriated back, the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases was over 90%, which I think speaks to the incidence of rape that happens there. I think, so those are kind of a couple of overseas examples. Then domestically, the Financial Action Task Force, which is a federal financial action task force, has just started a new working group that's being put to use by law enforcement and regulatory agencies to kind of strategically target criminals' modes and operations and identifying wealth, assets, and proceeds of their crimes, and is beginning to look at the trafficking crime more. So I don't know.
I was actually going to mention the same UNIEP group led by a guy named Matt Friedman, or until recently. And actually, he's a good answer, I think, to the second question, which is coordination and information sharing. I think today there's a relatively small number of folks like Matt who are basically critical nodes of information and hubs of connecting stakeholders with each other. I think one thing that we could definitely do more of as a community is try to work together. I know for my team, pretty much every project we do with an external partner, and hopefully we'll find ways to collaborate with some of the other folks on this panel in the future.
And we work very closely with you on ODC. We have a funding relationship. The president, in kind of keeping with the major speech he gave in September, has launched a tech advisory group that kind of meets on an ad hoc basis. I think there are, and we're exploring a number of public-private partnerships, but they do all wind up being ad hoc and really promising, but not yet scaled.
Yeah, I would say the same in terms of collaboration. This past 2 years, there's been a number of initiatives that have come out of Holland, actually, the University of Leiden and the Grotius Institute, but at the behest of the International Criminal Court, to basically, there's a real issue of problem of collecting evidence across borders, and I think that's one of the issues we didn't really touch on tonight, but these transnational networks, actually, it was mentioned in terms of drug trafficking, but it's very difficult for governments. There's a whole lot of bureaucratic loopholes that governments have to go through to acquire information from other governments on a particular crime that takes place. And so one of the things that's been happening is that there are informal information sharing mechanisms that are growing up. And really, it probably will stay at the informal level because a lot of different organizations have different sort of protocols and ethics that address how they are to operate or cooperate. For example, I think we're fairly familiar with the ethics that journalists abide by in terms of protecting their sources and when they should testify and when they should not. So there are a lot of these sort of walls between different types of organizations. Even when I was working for the UN monitoring the arms embargo and collected evidence that was very useful to support trials at the International Criminal Court, you can't imagine the legal sort of processes involved in just to acquire certain information from one UN institution to another. So again, most of this collaboration is going to take place at an informal level by entities who are very passionate about what they're doing and sort of working in that way. In terms of cross-collaboration between those who are looking at arms trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking, for example, there were, up until about sort of the early 2000s, most of these operations were separate from one another. One of the things that Victor Boot, for example, did, and the other arms traffickers, they made sure they never got involved in the drug business because that would send certain law enforcement agents after them. What happened in the early 2000s was, with the proliferation of weapons being so ubiquitous, they weren't making enough money. And so you can't just do these dry runs of weapons into countries anymore. You have to take out cassiterite gold or illicit natural resources, or you have to get involved in drugs. And that's actually ultimately what brought Victor Boot down, was his involvement with the FARC rebels in Colombia, laundering money. But that does, I think the number one sort of key for those of us who are kind of looking at these various types of criminal activities, one area of overlap is financial crimes and money laundering, and that seems to be where that seems to be a really good tool to use against these criminal operations that are operating across different types of commodities.
Mr. Evans mentioned that the primary goal of these foreign drug cartels was a repatriation of the money. Yet, when the FBI arrests United States business persons for laundering money, it's usually, that they invest the money here in the United States. They're laundering, these United States business people are laundering the money and investing it in United States business. So I'd ask you, what is the nexus between the repatriation and the investment of these drug profits in the United States?
Actually, that goes into what I was talking about. about 6 months ago, there was the news of major international and United States banks being involved much more than we had thought in depositing drug money and on a large scale, and I'm just wondering whether there's willingness on an international level and a domestic level to really go after those banks on a serious way, such that, let's say, a fine, even a large fine every decade, will not dissuade a corporation from doing something that it makes an overall profit from. But really jailing high-level officials may be a serious way of dissuading the type of money laundering you're talking about in all the fields that you're concerned about. Thanks.
Okay, on the money laundering issue, one of the useful elements that is now required of banks internationally is that they have compliance software. And so that's for sanctions, that's for designated entities that may be in violation of UN sanctions or may be in violation of particular government's laws. So that's actually a very useful tool for going after criminals. In terms of the banks institutionally, a lot of this money is actually moving towards offshore. I mean, offshore banking centers have long been affiliated with money laundering. But as the sort of, especially the drive by the U.S. in trying to target terrorist financing, it's moving a lot of these criminal entities to brass plate addresses, as we call it, or offshore banks. So that's where I think the effective law enforcement tools have to start sort of getting at those particular institutions. The rest of the financial institutions around the world, they are responsible for knowing their client. They will be charged. There are fines that are assessed against them if they are in violation of a compliance issue, but they're not going to be targeted for a criminal investigation, generally speaking, unless it's tax evasion.
Well, the only thing I'll note from a law enforcement perspective is, you know, financial investigations can be some of the most complicated investigations that are out there. I mean, you know, you have commingling of illegitimate funds with legitimate funds. You have you know, depending on, you know, the financial law or crimes laws that exist in certain countries, you know, it can be sometimes difficult to investigate certain crimes. For example, you know, we may, obviously, you know, tax evasion is an important thing of the IRS, and that they, you know, investigate that. You go, say, let's just pick the country of Panama, and we say, well, look, we have this investigation relating to tax evasion, and they kind of look at it like, well, U.S. tax evasion really isn't our problem. That's your problem. And so they may look at it and say, hey, we'll try to help you when we can, but really right now, you know, we're worried about all these other things. I've got, you know, 2 lawyers, 2 prosecutors, and a clerk in my office. I've got 150 case files here I got to deal with, so we'll kind of get to it. So the investigation of financial crime on a global context is very complicated. It's very difficult. Some of these investigations will run a course of years, if not up to a decade at times, to be able to collect all the evidence necessary to prosecute. So it is a very challenging thing, but we consider it very important because, again, we're trying to deny the very thing that these organizations want, and that's their money.
You should give the example of the Lebanese Canadian Bank.
A little bit about it.
Sure. So this was a DEA operation. You probably know far more than I do about it. But how many folks here have heard of the Lebanese Canadian Bank? I hadn't either. Oh, there are a couple. Wow. So it was a bank in Lebanon, not surprisingly, unrelated to Canada, more surprisingly, that turned out to be laundering significant quantities of illicit money for Hezbollah. And under the Patriot Act, there are certain authorities granted to the DEA and others to go after such banks. And so there was actually quite a significant, basically, sting operation on that bank run through the United States to seize some illicit money. So there are examples of us being proactive in the international arena.
With that, I am afraid our time has come to an end, so would you please join me in thanking our panelists very much for joining us. And I believe